Well, thank you. I'm very pleased to be here. I'm very pleased to be giving this talk. This is the place for this talk. Let's see. To thank the Tanner Humanities Center for bringing me here for the year as the Mormon Studies Fellow, various archivists, mentors, friends, and so on, Paul Reeve and Mormon Studies for sponsoring this particular lecture, and the Cook family for providing some photographs, because there are very few photographs of Melvin Cook online, and fewer of them are of decent quality. So they were very kind in sharing some. This is about Henry Eyring Sr. and Melvin Cook, two men who were very similar in a number of ways. For me as a historian, the most important one was they were both here. And so they both donated their papers to the U, which as a historian is really convenient. Melvin Cook has a 2-volume autobiography. He has extensive letters to various people. Henry Eyring similarly has a lot of correspondence in his extensive papers here. Then with Eyring, there are research papers on Eyring because of a master's thesis that was written on him by Stephen Heath. And Eyring read that master's thesis and approved it. And then there are a further number of research files on Eyring by Robert Miller, who was an employee of Special Collections, who was writing a biography of Eyring that was never published. And there's actually an interview of Heath by Miller about the master's thesis on Eyring. So there are many layers here to excavate of documents about these two men and their views. So some brief biography. First of all, Henry Eyring was born in 1901 in Colonia Juarez in Mexico, part of the Mexican diaspora there to avoid legal problems with plural marriage. He receives his PhD from Berkeley at age 26 in physical chemistry. He then takes a job at Princeton from 1931 to 1946, where he is fairly prominent. And then in 1946, the University of Utah recruits him to come be the dean of the graduate school. And he really takes the graduate school from a fairly small thing, turning out very few graduates, to a massive thing, churning out lots of PhDs and master's students, particularly in chemistry. He was also athletic. Here he is at age 75. He was in the habit of running races with his students and also showing how he could jump up on top of a table from a standstill. Now about his relationship to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and religion in general. Eyring was close to a number of church leaders, both by relation. He was Spencer Kimball's brother-in-law, but also through function and sociality. He served on the General Sunday School Board for many years, and he was a committed Latter-day Saint. There is one story I don't think is very well known because it's buried fairly deep about Eyring's degree of commitment, perceptions of that commitment, and his talent and intellect. In November 1952, John A. Whitsoe dies. And Whitsoe is the last apostle in the Quorum of the 12 with advanced scientific training. He had a PhD in chemistry. Shortly thereafter, Carl Christensen sends a letter to Henry Eyring. Christensen was the dean of the chemistry department, and he had also worked with Eyring on the General Sunday School Board, so he knew Eyring on both sides. And in this letter, he congratulates Eyring on his new calling as an apostle, replacing Whitsoe. Christensen admits it hasn't happened yet, but he knows it will because of two things. The first one is, he says, personal inspiration. But the second one, he says, there has always been an apostle in the quorum, and there is no one else to fill those shoes but you, and you will do it so well. I think I know you better than anyone but your wife. And as it turns out, Eyring was in fact nominated to join the Quorum of the 12. That comes from David O. McKay's journal, if I remember correctly. But ultimately, Witza was replaced by Adam S. Benyon, who was a businessman who had earlier served as the Church Commissioner of Education back in the 1920s, when he was very pro people teaching religion should go get educated in Bible and history and archaeology, and he was also pro-evolution, and he did some CES trainings along those lines. But he was not ultimately a scientist, and so that was no replacement of a scientist in the quorum. Now, as for Melvin Cook, he was born in 1911 near Bear Lake in northern Utah. He received his PhD from Yale in 1937 in physical chemistry. And then he stuck around in New Jersey for the next 10 years working for DuPont Chemical and as part of a government brain trust. He was an explosive specialist, and if you look at these years, 1937 to 47, what does the government want with a brain trust having to do with explosives and chemistry? In 1947, Henry Eyring, who is now the dean of the graduate school, recruits him to come to the U, hires him on as a full professor of metallurgy in the chemistry department. Cook held over 100 patents, published more than 200 articles, 6 books, and received numerous international recognitions and awards, including the Nitro Nobel Medal, which is often confused for the Nobel Prize. I don't know if you can make this out, but those are multiple languages up there. He's being recognized by various European countries and Spanish-speaking countries and so on. So to summarize some of the similarities here between these two, they are 10 years apart in age. They had the same PhD specialization, not just chemistry, but physical chemistry. They knew each other in New Jersey because they both worked for the same brain trust on explosives. And in fact, Cook writes in his journal that when he was in graduate school, before he went up to New Jersey, he actually really looked up to Eyring as kind of a mentor and a guiding light, and invited him to come down and speak to their branch there in, I think he said Philadelphia. I don't remember why he's in Philadelphia. And then he notes that he struck him as a little unorthodox, which is maybe foreshadowing of what's to come. After Eyring went to the U, he brought Cook on. Both published extensively. Both received numerous international awards and recognition for their contributions to science. Both were devout Latter-day Saints who gave frequent lectures on science and religion. There are a lot of notes about these in both of their archives. Thank you notes from various people, scheduling questions. Eyring in particular, it seems that the first presidency would assign him in some capacity to go to academic conferences and universities and kind of speak on science and religion, and he would report back to them. It's not clear in what capacity he was doing that, but he was most definitely doing it. So with so many similarities, they became miles apart on one key issue. Namely, Eyring spoke repeatedly about the earth being billions of years old, whereas Cook became the most prominent Latter-day Saint member of the Creation Research Society and argued that creation was somewhat recent. Now, there are some nuances to his position. Maybe we can get into those in the Q&A. They're interesting. But with so many similarities, what accounted for these differences? Why did they bifurcate so much? And here I need to introduce a third person to this story, namely Joseph Fielding Smith. In the 20th century among Latter-day Saints, Smith was the primary driver of creationism. And I did a lecture on that 2 weeks ago here. It's on YouTube. I'm trying not to overlap with it too much. But Smith gets us into the core issue with a letter he wrote in 1950 to Eyring. Eyring was on a committee at that point, writing a special manual for the youth of the church, collaborating on a special manual. And after a meeting that was apparently kind of warm with different opinions in this committee, I don't know who else was on it or how many people, Smith wrote a 5-page letter to Eyring expressing some of his scientific and religious views and how they related to each other. And at the end of the letter, he just asks Eyring, Are not these conclusions reasonable? Now, I'm not aware of a response. I haven't found one in the archives. But given what Eyring has said elsewhere, I think I can guess how he might have responded. Eyring was very explicitly aware of the chain of reasoning from premises and assumptions to data to conclusions and proofs. And I think he might have responded, the logic may be impeccable, but the conclusion may be completely wrong because you started out with the wrong postulates. Proof depends upon your premises. Every proof in science depends on the postulates one accepts. The same is true of religion. Ultimately, you will always get back to postulates. So Smith's conclusions might have been reasonable given his premises. But what about those premises? And for my purposes this evening, postulates, premises, assumptions, I don't know what will come out of my mouth. They're all the same for my purposes this evening. But much of what I'm going to talk about revolves around how particular assumptions lead to particular positions, and where and why Eyring and Cook made different assumptions that led them in different directions. Now, Joseph Fielding Smith, more vocabulary here, held a young Earth anti-evolution position, and I want to distinguish positions from frameworks. And by frameworks or paradigms, I mean an interconnected series of assumptions. So he's got his young Earth position, which flows from his particular framework or paradigm of assumptions. Now, there are three key assumptions in this framework. And this framework is that Scripture should dictate science to us. Scripture should dominate scientific research. The first assumption was that Scripture, like the early chapters of Genesis, are making assertions and claims about natural history, that is, science. We call this assumption concordism. Very common among Latter-day Saints and just about everyone else until relatively recently. Second assumption, because Scripture is inspired by an omniscient God, those scientific claims and assertions are facts and entirely correct and reliable. We call this inerrancy. Heavily debated, at least outside Latter-day Saints. Third assumption, and this is key, these inerrant facts are obvious and plain because the meaning of Scripture is obvious and plain and requires nothing more than reading it. Call this literal reading. Sometimes Smith referred to it as reading plainly. Now, literal reading is particularly pernicious because it denies that one is interpreting while one is in the process of interpreting. I wrote myself some metaphors here. It's like putting glasses on someone that distorts their view while telling them they're seeing how things really are and they're not wearing glasses at all. It's kind of an intellectual sleight of hand in which one implicitly claims one's own interpretation is merely what Scripture obviously says. It's the denial of interpretation completely. Pay no attention to the assumptions behind the curtain, right? Now this leads me to a visual. This is a very old model that goes back to Origen and St. Augustine and early Christianity. The idea was that God had given humans two books that described reality. One was the book of Scripture, and the other was the book of nature. They had to agree somehow because both ultimately came from the same source, from an omniscient, divine God. Now, Augustine argued that you had to read both of these together. One did not dominate the other. They were reciprocal in some sense. Of course, science 1,600 years ago was very, very different than it was today. Now, when it came to Joseph Fielding Smith, his assumptions led to a different relationship between these two books. Namely, because he held these three assumptions, and again, this is demonstrated at obnoxious length in some of my blog posts and lectures, for him the corollary was that Scripture is true science, because true science had to start with the inerrant facts of science revealed clearly in Scripture. To put this visually, humans had to interpret the book of nature, at least the parts of it they could read. And this introduced a lot of limitations to it, right? But on the other hand, the book of Scripture had no such limitations. Scripture was purely divine, required no human interpretation. There was no speculation involved. It was not partial. Note how in this view there are simply no human processes acknowledged at all on the side of the book of Scripture. And so this gives us a construction, a model in which Scripture gives us true science, and because that's true science, human science must bow to that. That was the framework that he had from these three assumptions, and it was reinforced heavily by particular people he read, which I talk about in the other lectures: Seventh-day Adventists, British creationists, and so on. So, with some of this theoretical stuff behind us, let's go a little bit more into the history. In 1953, Smith and Cook are living in the same ward. And Smith's son-in-law, Hoyt Brewster, is the bishop. And Smith's son-in-law, Bruce R. McConkie, says, you've got this science manuscript, you should have that guy in your ward read it. And he can comment on it from the perspective of a scientist, which is exactly what happens. Smith asks Cook to read this manuscript, which he does. And Cook later writes, this book appeared to be a great contribution to an important and vitally interesting subject, although not in agreement with the scientific theories now in vogue. From the factual viewpoint, I thought it was accurate, fair, and objective. Moreover, from my own study, which I must confess was at that time rather inadequate, I saw in this manuscript the real truth and realized that it represented my own belief regarding this important subject. In having him read this manuscript, Smith converts Cook to his framework of assumptions, which lead to the scientific positions. Once you become convinced that plain language reading of Scripture should dominate science, everything else follows from that. And so Cook writes the introduction to the 1954 book, Man, His Origin and Destiny, giving it the aura of his own international scientific authority. He writes, and note the language here, the author is well versed in the scientific method and a strong supporter of true science. He has adopted this very, very quickly. Now, Smith's assumptions are evident in Cook's actions and writings after 1954, so just very briefly, we are not always certain that the theories of men are true. We are certain when the Lord has given us something that it is true. And I want to ask, but has the Lord given us what Cook is saying he's giving us? Has the Lord given us Cook's interpretation, or is Cook interpreting? Do we not use the facts that we have in the Scriptures? Why shouldn't we? They are the greatest facts we have. They are the ones we can be sure of. Again, he's collapsing that distance between interpreter and Scripture. There's no interpretation here. Several LDS scientists have referred to the history of the earth written in the rocks, that is, the book of nature, implying that it has been as readable as the Scriptures themselves. Now, what I get out of this quote and the context is, well, Scripture is plain and obvious. And some of these scientists have made it seem like science is just as obvious as Scripture is, which is completely wrong, of course. It seems illogical to assert that the church has taken no stand on the age of the earth. The Scriptures themselves are the stand taken by the church. Well, that's great. But whose interpretation of the Scriptures represents the church's position on the age of the earth? What assumptions are being made by the various interpreters? If there is really no interpretation being offered, then how do you adjudicate and weigh different proposals and claims for what the Scriptures really say? And lastly, I intended to make my science conform to what God has told us through his prophets. Scripture was supposed to dominate science. That was just the way things were. So, what makes the difference here? Well, the first thing is assumptions. It's quite possible that Eyring shared assumption number one, that Scripture was providing natural history of the earth in some way. He didn't leave much of a paper trail about that. It would be surprising if he didn't have that assumption. But it's assumptions 2 and 3 that are really the ones steering us in a particular direction. And he does leave a bit of a paper trail showing that he did not share those assumptions, nor the Scripture dominates science framework that was entailed by them. And I just went for one here because I think it's a really good one. There are some people who throw away the Scriptures and restrict themselves to science and related fields. In other words, book of nature only. Others use the scriptures to the exclusion of other truths, and this is essentially the true science of Scripture dominates the other one. We don't have to listen to the scientists because we've already got all the answers from Scripture. Both are wrong. I love his bluntness. Latter-day Saints should seek after truth by all avenues with earnest humility. There is, of course, no conflict in the gospel since it embraces all truth. Undoubtedly, however, science is continually challenging us to think through again our conceptions of the gospel. This should work both ways, of course. That is, Eyring thought that one's understanding of Scripture should be shaped by human discovery, and vice versa. The two books of nature and Scripture did not dominate each other, but stood on reciprocal grounds. And note who he's writing this to. This is after the first presidency had assigned him to go to some kind of multi-university conference. He was not so scientific, he was attending multiverse conferences in 1952. As far as I know, there's no evidence of that in the archives. And he had written them back and mentioned as a side note the apparent conflict between Scripture and carbon dating. And the first presidency said, very graciously, thanks for your report, thanks for carrying out this assignment. Also, what are you talking about? And so he writes them this letter in which he lays out the groundwork for things like carbon dating and radioactive clocks, and that's the context for him saying we need both of these books. We need humility, and we need to be drawing from every source we can. So if the first major difference between Eyring and Cook had to do with the active assumptions they were bringing to their work, the second one, which is not entirely unrelated, had to do with their training. Now, Eyring gets asked about evolution a lot, and sometimes he would demur with some humor. As a devout Latter-day Saint, the important fact for me is that the Lord is directing the affairs in his universe, not exactly how he does it. Whether or not organic evolution was used or is operating seems to me to be beside the point. He is infinitely wise. I just work here. Eyring had chemistry on his mind all the time, and he just didn't seem to see these as big issues. I went hunting for this, and my searchability in the thousands of pages I've scanned just was not coming up. But at some point, someone says to Eyring, what do you believe about how God created the earth? And he says something like, I believe he created it however he did it. We're just in process of discovering that. So he was not dogmatic about this. On the other hand, at times he affirmed evolution, and when he did, he would cite his training in geology. Because whereas Cook did his undergrad degree and his master's degree in chemistry, Eyring started very practically in mining engineering and geology. And so in these other letters, and note that these are all private letters, he says, being trained as a geologist, evolution answers many otherwise difficult problems for me, and I find no conflict with it in the gospel. I was trained as a mining engineer, so that the evidence seems to me to point toward an age of the earth of between 4 and 5 billion years into the existence of pre-Adamic man. I have no difficulty in reconciling myself to the idea of life before Adam and to a great age of the earth. President McKay says the church takes no position with respect to organic evolution. As a trained geologist, organic evolution seems to me to explain many difficult questions, so that I tend to think in terms of it. This, however, does not affect my faith in the gospel. So what did make the difference? Assumptions and training. So Cook was convinced that Scripture was, in essence, the divine answer key that science was eventually trying to work out. And not sharing those assumptions, and with some geological training, Eyring was unwilling to hand-wave away all of the geological evidence, all of the mainstream established geology at that point, as frauds or fakes, as Smith did in Man, His Origin and Destiny, and as Cook did in some of his writings. Eyring did not assume he had the final answers, either from science or scripture, and I think you see some of that humility coming out in some of the things I've quoted here. So training also played a role not just in Eyring's greater willingness to look at geology and say, well, this is what the best evidence says, but also in his reluctance to pass judgment or make final calls on evolution in public. And there is, interesting enough, an interview with one of his sons, Ted, whom I believe was also a chemistry professor at the U. Yeah. So this is an interview with him from Robert Miller. Eyring certainly thought that there was a great deal of merit in the theory of evolution, but he would dwell at much greater length on radioactive dating of the Earth, the fact that the Earth is many, many billions of years old. There are physics and chemistry arguments for the age of the Earth that he understood well. He was wise enough to realize that he wasn't an authority on the subject of evolution, whereas he was a definite authority in such subjects as geology that he knew well. So I think that's the reason that he would be somewhat more cautious about what he would say of a definitive kind about evolution. Now what is this? Well, I'll just go through in order. I've got 4 conclusions from having read extensively in both of their papers, and autobiography and the biographical master's thesis and the interview about the biographical master's thesis. First, Eyring and Cook embody 2 clear phenomena in the history of this debate, LDS or not, America or not. The evolution-creation debate is not religion versus science, nor believers versus atheists. Those are false framings regardless of who tells it to you. And the funny thing is, you can get that from the extremes on both sides. Richard Dawkins, I'm thinking Ken Ham, getting ahead of myself. Richard Dawkins, who is one of the prominent new atheists and evolutionary biologist in England, sees this as a war between religion and science, which is a very 19th century framework, funny enough. And Ken Ham, who is the most prominent creation ministry today, he runs Answers in Genesis, he runs the Creation Museum, he runs the Ark Encounter in Kentucky. He also agrees that this is really science versus religion, because he buys into this framework that the Bible really gives you the true science. If these are not good framings, then what is really the debate about? At its heart, it is one of authority and ways of knowing. And I have a lot I would say about this, maybe in the Q&A. Second conclusion in 2 parts. The second part of this conclusion. Much of the literature of the creation-evolution debate focuses on the details and interpretation of scientific data. And if you read the arguments between Cook and Eyring, they are eye-glazing over, boring, technical. Pages of formulas and chemical breakdowns, and it's not even an argument that you can really follow unless you're probably a PhD in chemistry. I don't know. But if much of the literature has focused on the scientific data, the deeper issue of the debate concerns the nature and practice of science. Cook and Eyring debated this stuff all the time. In various interviews and from their own papers, they were aware that they had starkly different views. It doesn't seem like it got personal at times, but it could certainly get warm. Eyring loved to debate. He loved to get into a real kind of intellectual, well, up until he was 16, he actually just really liked to get into physical fights. He liked to debate. He liked to back and forth. He liked to throw it out there and get it back. But they never talked about the nature of science. And Cook, following Joseph Fielding Smith, who was following Seventh-day Adventist George McCready Price, were in effect operating with a different understanding of the nature of science, because true science started with Scripture. But this begged the question, of course, in the classical sense, what did Scripture say? What was the nature of Scripture? How should Scripture be understood? And in this sense, they also exemplify the other half of this. And first part, this is a completely different scholar, sounds almost identical to the last one. The debate has tended to take place on scientific grounds, focusing on the interpretation of scientific data and theories, rather than the interpretation of Scripture. And this guy's a historian of Scripture and religion and a little bit of science, whereas Pond and Pond, whom I was quoting earlier, they're scientists of some sort. They're writing in a pedagogical science, thing. If it is Scripture and assumptions about Scripture that ultimately drive creationism and creationist appropriations of scientific data and conclusions, and this is indisputably the cause for 99% of creationists. There are, I could probably count them on one hand, the number of atheist scientists who accept a young Earth, there just really aren't any, with very, very rare exceptions. There are a number of scientists with very respectable degrees who believe in a young Earth, but they all come from a conservative Christian background and have been very blunt about these assumptions, about inerrancy, about concordism, about Scripture must be true, therefore it follows that science must be wrong. And we will use science to prove that science is wrong and prove the Bible is true, which again raises the question, the Bible true or your interpretation of the Bible true? And how are you getting your interpretation? What are the assumptions that you're bringing to your interpretation? How have you arrived at this? We are better served talking about the root cause, that is the interpretation of Scripture and assumptions around it, than the effects and the secondary conclusions. Ken Ham, to return to Ham, had a debate 10 or 15 years ago with Bill Nye, the science guy, which for people like me was eye-rollingly ridiculous before it even started, because they were operating with such a completely different set of assumptions that they were talking past each other. Nye kept focusing on scientific data, scientific data, scientific data. And you know what? The creationists all know that they don't match up with mainstream scientific data. But because of these assumptions, they are convinced that they have indisputable proof that those scientific conclusions, however logical, are incorrect. And so you have to talk about the assumptions more, which brings me full circle to